Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're back to finish off Naoki Urasawa's 20th Century Boys. And as before, I wanted to comment on the cover because this is the only cover we really get that shows us old Kenji. He, of course, is on the cover of the first volume and the last volume. Now, that's not the case, I believe, with the thinner Taco Band collected versions. They had very different covers. But I think for these collected versions, this is an appropriate ending for the saga. Or is it? We're going to talk about that at the end. For now, we pick up where the story left off. Friend has just announced to the world that he was behind everything, all of the virus attacks, all the bioweapons, and now he's going to exterminate the human race in 1 week. Unsurprisingly, this causes a lot of discontent worldwide, but most notably in Tokyo itself, where the FDP is headquartered, there are 2 days of rioting and looting, which are just sort of glossed over from the storytelling perspective. Presumably, our heroes just sort of hunkered down, at least the ones that were in Tokyo, and rode things out. We join them as they are coming out and picking up the pieces. Tokyo is a little bit quieter now than it was immediately after the announcement, and we find that people are putting the pieces in place. They already believe that the Expo Plaza is going to be their safe zone, and they're working up ways for people to get there safely. In order to make the announcement, Kana is going to the local broadcasting studio so that they have a forum to get the news out about the safe place that they're going to set up at the Expo Plaza. When they get there, they are met by a figure with a gun, and this of course turns out to be number 13. He landed on the roof of the building via helicopter, the same helicopter we saw him riding out on at the beginning of the volume, and he and Kanchi have been working to set up a working transmission tower because the building was in shambles when they got there. So all in all, our opening just establishes the new status quo and shows us that for the most part, the plans that our heroes had in place are going to continue to develop. We see that Kanchi is using the famous song of Kenji's that has been featured really throughout the third act to get people's attention. And we see that Sanae and her younger brother have also been distributing the song, this time by cassette tape, to the people around Tokyo. And this has kind of primed the pump, as it were. Everyone has heard this song already. Most people who have heard it like it. And so when they hear it on the radio, they're ready to sit up and take notice. This leads to Kana's stroke of genius. The big issue, of course, after the public faith in Friend has been destroyed, is how you get them to trust in something else. How do you convince them that it's safe to actually go to the plaza when everything else that they believed was safe just a couple days ago has just been forcibly torn apart? Kana realizes she can kick off a music festival at the World Expo Plaza, and she promises that Bob Lennon, Kenji's stage name, for lack of a better term, will be there performing his music, along with a bunch of other well-known artists. This is a pretty obvious technique to use, given that this is the thing everybody seems to have their faith in right now, but it's also thematically appropriate. We have been hearing about whether music can or cannot change the world, whether art is a significant force in a dystopian world like the one that people are living in, pretty much since the manga artists were reintroduced a couple of volumes ago. And while Kenji seems to have come down on the side of no, you can't change the world with just music, a lot of other people are going with yes. Sanae says that the song makes her feel safe, and in this time of worry, in this time of distress, a lot of people in Tokyo seem to be agreeing with her. So the idea of doing a Woodstock, of finally giving Kenji this chance to perform his music on the world stage, is a brilliant culmination of this storyline that has run all the way through the manga. Kenji has always wanted to be a musician. He's always wanted to pack out the Budokan, which is no longer around. He's always wanted to be a world-famous rock and roll guitarist. And now that he's old in his 50s. He's wiser than he was as a child. Kenji can still do that, and he doesn't mind doing it. But he realizes there are other things he has to think about, other things that have to be important to him as well. And I think the fact that Kenji goes everywhere but the Expo Plaza across this part of the story is a sign of the new maturity that Kenji has as compared to who he was even when he was a man in his late 30s, just before Bloody New Year's Eve. Because this entire concert is being organized without any input from him. It is kind of a if you build it, they will come moment. Everybody believes in this to a much greater extent than Kenji does. And while he does eventually answer their expectations, he knows there are other things he has to do that are going to be more important first. And most of the story arc is about him doing those things. We get a flashback that shows how Kanchi met Kenji out in Hokkaido during Kenji's wandering period after Bloody New Year's Eve. And that's an interesting bit, but it's really just exposition. It only tells us a little bit about Kenji and Kanchi. It gives us some details we didn't know, which is nice, but it doesn't really develop their characters a whole lot. After that, we see what the FDP is doing. And the Chief Dream Navigator is trying to hold things together. She's not succeeding a whole lot. She's doing it primarily through fear and intimidation, which have always been her tactics, so perhaps that's not surprising. But while the very core of the FDP has fallen in line, they are not really true believers anymore. And you can see that in the stress and the uncertainty that is running through their ranks at every level. In the meantime, we see Kana putting together a lineup. The band that Kyoko Koizumi followed around is recruited to play at the music festival, and they try and get Haro Namio to come as the Enka singer, not as Kenji's drummer. And of course, Namio has always been more interested in being Kenji's drummer than in being the Enka singer. So he declines as himself. And there is really a great moment in here where he goes into a small bar and restaurant, and he meets up with this guy here, who turns out to be Kenji's bassist. And I like this reunion scene because it shows that while Namio is the one who went on to be big and successful, he never forgot his roots. And he knows that now is the time. They have to put the band back together. They have to be ready when Kenji shows up. There's no doubt in either of these men that Kenji will be there when they need him, because he was always there before when they were a band the first time. So it's a very nice moment, and it shows the impact that Kenji has made on even people we haven't seen lasted a long time. We get a lot of detail-oriented storytelling. Again, we have moments where Urasawa is filling in the blanks to make it clear that people are doing the right things to get ready for the disaster that could be coming if not everything works out the way they hope. We see Kiriko prepping to mass manufacture her vaccine. We see Maro and Karoyan sneaking into Tokyo to distribute the vaccines they have there. But the really interesting part here is when they wind up sneaking into Tokyo via sewer, they're met by an army of children wearing these masks. And we learn through this that Sadakiyo is not as dead as we thought he was. He's come back, and he's willing to play his part again. We don't find out in this arc of the story how it is Sadakiyo survived his car exploding, or whether he did that himself in order to fake his own death and escape from consequences. The latter seems unlikely given his resolve when he departed the story last in 2015, but you never know. So we have Yoshitsune and his organization teaming up with Yukiji to make a final push to take the FDP headquarters. Acho has been training on piloting the giant robot, but Shikishima has given him a remote control device which will make it easier to use the robot than trying to ride on it. But it turns out that the mole that we have known is in Yoshitsune's organization for some time has stolen the remote and turned it over to this generation's friend. And friend uses that to boot up the robot and go on a rampage. This brings us full circle to the opening sequence. If you think way back, we saw the robot stomping around in a desolate kind of dystopian cityscape, and we saw a young lady sitting up in bed, which turned out later to be Kana. And we come back to this moment again. Kana collapses from exhaustion before the robot boots up, and we see her wake up and look out the window to see the robot on the rampage. A nice little tying off of the bow that tells us, yes, we are really at the end of the story now. That very first hanging plot thread that we've been thinking about for years has finally paid off. There are a few other important early plot threads to tie up. We see that the detective who murdered his partner, who murdered Cho-san, is finally coming to justice. Cho-san's grandson has come for him. Chono has put all the pieces together, and he's come back to collect this guy. And it's interesting because there is a confrontation where all the details come out, and we get even a couple of retcons here. We find out that Cho-san knew about both of Friend's true identities, both the person who's wearing the mask now and the person who was wearing it in the past. So this reinforces the idea that there have always been two people in on this conspiracy. Again, I don't like this kind of retconning because it's very clear from the early parts, comparing the early parts of the story to some of the later developments, that this was something that Urasawa came up with about halfway through the story. I don't really have a problem with the idea if it had been properly supported by the earliest parts of the narrative. Again, I feel like it isn't. And I'll talk about that again at length when we do our wrap-up after going through 21st Century Boys, which is this, I guess people call it a sequel. You can think of it as that. You can also just think of it as a continuation. I'll say a bit more about that as we go on. This part of the story is important, though, because it kind of puts a bow on Chono's arc. We've seen him trying to live up to his grandfather, and when he has the opportunity here, when his grandfather's killer is shot as part of another FDP purge, Cho-san collects him, doesn't leave him to die, collects him, and takes him to face justice. He's going to get a trial, he's going to be tried, and he is going to get that final closure. And that is a sign that Chono has matured. He's not a child who freaks out at the threat of violence. He's not ruled primarily by his emotions, as we often saw him being, especially during back in 2015. He is a seasoned man now. He's seen a lot of terrible things, and he's decided that what he has to do as a result of that is do everything he can to make sure that justice, as his grandfather understood it, is upheld. He wants to carry on the reputation of the legendary detective Cho-san, and that means he has to bring criminals to justice. He can't just leave them to die at the hands of their enemies. He can't take justice into his own hands. That's a pretty good story arc for this guy, who was, when we first met him, a very green and silly person. He has now become a very serious and sober-minded individual, and it's good to see. We continue to see this kind of maturity play out because we get another, what I refer to as personality confrontation. Yoshitsune and Yukiji go to the FDP headquarters, and they force their way past the guards pretty much through the power of Yoshitsune's personality. And that's very strange because, a reminder, Yoshitsune looks like this. He doesn't have, at first glance, an overpowering charisma to him. What he has is a lifetime of experience. What he has is a sense of what it means to be downtrodden, and what he has is an understanding of what it takes to do that. Sometimes that means you have to take action, and sometimes that means you have to stand aside. What he convinces the FDP, or at least the rank and file of the FDP, to do now is to stand aside and do nothing. They just have to let the change happen. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do in your life. And he convinces them to do it. This is impressive because it shows that Yoshitsune, as always, is the one in the group with the capacity for leadership. No one else has this understanding of large group dynamics among Kenji's friends. Yoshitsune is the only one who's been able to keep a group, an organization, an army in check this way. And this is, I think, the perfect culmination for his story arc as well. After this, we get a flashback in which we see this odd badge that came in packs of gum when Kenji was a child. And we're told this is the emblem of justice. This seems to be the source of the original animosity between Kenji and Friend, but we're not going to get the full story now. So we'll unpack that a bit more when we talk about 21st Century Boys. So the robot is in motion. We see that Friend is controlling it via the remote control he's stolen. Maro and Kana go back to the school building where they first met back in 2015. Or no, I guess not Maro. Who goes to the school building? Remind me of this. Oh, that's right. Maro and Kenji go there. I thought it was Kana because that's who went in 2015. But yes, Maro and Kenji meet up in the streets. There isn't a big emotional reunion, which is an interesting creative choice, but I think it makes sense given that at this point, most people have realized that Kenji is still alive. And both Maro and Kenji and most of their friends have shown the ability to put aside their emotional hangups in the face of these great tasks that are laid out before them. So I can't say I'm too surprised that there isn't a huge amount of dialogue or exposition between these two when they meet again. I would have liked it if it was a more powerful, more poignant moment, but it's not, and I understand why. So Kenji and Friend confront each other for the first time since Bloody New Year's Eve. We learn that whatever transpired between Kenji and the current Friend when they were children, it was enough that the man wearing the Friend mask decided that Kenji had to be the king of evil. He assigned Kenji the role of the villain in his life story. Everything that has happened since has played out because of that, to a part. But he also reveals that since he's not the previous man who wore the Friend mask, he doesn't value the same things, and he has no problem killing everyone at the Expo Plaza. So he sends his flying saucers and their bioweapons to do just that. Acho, who we have seen training to ride the giant robot, climbs up into it and disables the remote control system, and then uses the robot's gun platforms to shoot down the flying saucers. A decent moment, and a decent payoff for his character arc. Not a perfect one, but we see that after all of this time, he has kind of reached a spot where he can defend people he cares about. That has always been his issue, because of course he wasn't there when his wife and son died in a flood. He wasn't there to protect them and look over them, and finally he has managed to put himself in the position where he can do that. I think it's a decent finishing to his character arc. Such as it is. Of course, Acho has always been the person who had to undergo the least development during the main part of the story. Most of Acho's character development takes place in the flashbacks where we learn about his family's death. Since then, he's really just been trying to put into place the lessons he learned then, and now he's finally done it. However, he only has 2 guns on the robot, and there are 3 flying saucers, so the third one has to be dealt with. Because Acho cannot reload the guns on his own. The shells are too heavy. So number 13 is up there in his helicopter. And he goes out and crashes into the final saucer and puts an end to that threat. Friend is still squared off against Kenji. He still has a card to play. And he tries to play it. But Sadakio is there, and he hijacks the moment. And then we see Kenji just sort of say that things are done. and we need to put an end to them. And then we jump cut the Expo Plaza. After we see the concerts going on, we see Acho patched up, and finally we see Kanchi announcing that Kenji's band is coming on to play his music. They play 3 songs, none of which are the one that made him famous. And then Kenji walks off stage. We see his friends looking on and enjoying the moment. And then we have probably one of the best panels in the entire series, where Kenji and Kana are reunited. That's pretty much the end. That is the end of 20th Century Boys as it was written. It's an extremely satisfying and unsatisfying ending at the same time. We see the payoff to a lot of the important character arcs for major characters. We see the end of Kenji's character arc, where he makes his peace with his calling and his duty to those around him. We see the end of Yoshitsune's character arc, where he comes into his own as a leader and as a general. We see the end of Acho's character arc, where he finally defends those he cares about against danger. And we see the end of the FDP, for the most part. But we don't close the mystery of who Friend is, or at least who the new Friend is. We don't close off the questions about why he had such a big rivalry with Kenji. And we don't see Kenji's reuniting with most of his friends. We see his brief encounter with Maro, and of course we see his emotional reunion with his niece, but he doesn't talk to Yukiji or Yoshitsune or Acho, and that's a real disappointment, because they've been separated so long, and we want to know what he would think of the way these people have changed. We also want to see him talk to his sister, because they were very close when they were kids. We know that very well. But they went in radically different directions, and the meeting between those two is something that is going to be important and meaningful. So I think for what 20th Century Boys is as a story about the importance of balancing your dreams and your duties, this is pretty much the end point. And a lot of the big question marks about the things we've seen and what drove them, those are difficult questions to sort out. But they're not part of the narrative through line that makes 20th Century Boys tick. It would be part of the narrative through line to see Kenji come back together with his friends. And I'm disappointed that's not in here, especially because, as I think I've said before, I feel the story in general, and the third act in particular, do drag in places. But this is where the original run ends, and I'm not entirely sure why that was. As I've said before, there is a sequel, 21st Century Boys, that includes the official ending and an alternate explanation of some events. I'm not going to talk too much about that ending because I intend to cover it as well. So I will, talk about that when I actually go through that installment. I don't know why, publishing-wise, the story is separated like this. Maybe it has to do with Urasawa's original pitches, but if you look here at the very end, after we see Kana's reunion with Kenji, we see him as an adult meeting himself as a child, saying he's come to settle things. This suggests that he's gone into the hologram system, and that's kind of a teaser at the end. I don't know if that was in the original magazine publishing run or if that was added to the collected version. But it shows that Urasawa was kind of thinking that these would go together. And in fact, that's not surprising. I was originally under the impression that the magazine this was published in changed hands somehow, or that he had gotten injured. I saw rumors to that effect at the time this was being published, which is when I read it. But That, I mean, it was 2006, 2007, so it was not as easy to get information about the Japanese comics industry in the States at that time. So based on the research that I've done, that appears to be just rumors. And in fact, when Viz Media picked up Monster and 20th Century Boys, Urasawa's two series at the time, for distribution in the United States, they chose to release Monster first. And in their press release, they said that's because the way they were told, at least, or they believed, that's the way Urasawa wanted them to do it. Later on, Urasawa would say he had no knowledge of that instruction at the time. So clearly there was a lot of miscommunication and cross-communication about why things were taking place the way they were. All I can say is, I don't know why we have 20th Century Boys, and then as a separate installment of the story, 21st Century Boys. There was only a month between the ending of this series and 21st Century Boys going into publication. Same magazine this was published in, under the same publisher. So I just don't know what happened. I don't know why Urasawa chose to create this break. I don't know if he chose to create this break in the story. I don't know if it was something his publishers mandated for some reason. But it's there. And I have to say, not bad. As I said, I think every major through line and major plot thread that the story introduces is resolved, except for the final meeting between Kenji and his friends. And that's a big deal, don't get me wrong. It's important to have that kind of emotional closure to your character arcs. But did we really need all the details at the end? I don't think we do. I think we get a pretty solid sense of what happened for the most part. I'll talk more about that when we get to the end. But it's a wild ride, this series, and Urasawa does a great job of juggling all of his character threads, all of his plot threads, and the fact that there's only one that gets snarled due to his own writing, and another one that appears to have been snarled for business reasons, although I don't know exactly what they were, as I said. It's very impressive, especially for a series like this that ran for, I think, about a decade. All in all, impressive work. And the themes here, the themes of coming of age, of balancing your responsibilities and your dreams, and of recapturing that optimism that you put aside when the duties that plague you get really heavy, as Kenji does at the beginning of the story, these really resonate. And they seem to have resonated with people of all ages. This is aimed at an audience of people in their late 20s and early 30s. But I first read this when I was 19. And I loved it then. I still love it now. I think it's great storytelling. And I'm not the only one. People of all ages have enjoyed this story. And I think they will continue to. It's very impressive. And for all that it is set in very specific time periods, it's a timeless story. Very good stuff. We'll talk more about the characters as a whole after we look at 21st Century Boys. But until then, let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.